the frozen graveyard of empires. There is a place where ambition freezes, where the dreams of conquerors turn to frost and bone, a land so vast, so merciless, that even the greatest empires of human history have broken upon its plains. Russia, the graveyard of invaders. Two men, separated by a century, both believed they could master it. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, and Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Germany. Both ruled Europe. Both saw Russia as their final conquest, and both failed, utterly, catastrophically. Their downfall was not mere coincidence. It was the inevitable consequence of arrogance colliding with geography, hubris meeting endurance, and ambition outpacing wisdom. This is the story of how two empires tried to conquer the same land and lost everything. The dream of total control. To understand why both men made the same fatal mistake, we must understand what drove them. Napoleon Bonaparte saw himself as the bringer of civilization, the genius who reshaped Europe under the banner of modernity. By 1812, he controlled most of the continent, yet one empire stood defiant. Russia, under Tsar Alexander the Hitler, more than a century later, saw himself as the builder of a 1,000-year Reich. By 1941, Europe once again bowed to a single power, Nazi Germany. But in the east lay the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, a rival ideology, a rival empire, and a threat to Hitler's vision of domination. Both leaders stood at the height of their power. Both turned east and saw destiny. But destiny, as history teaches, is a dangerous illusion. The first march east, Napoleon's Grand Gamble, June 1812. Napoleon's Grande Armée, over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe, marched toward Russia. It was the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, a moving city of men, horses, cannons, and dreams of glory. The French expected a swift campaign. A few decisive battles, a forced treaty, and Russia humbled before Napoleon's might. But the Russians refused to play by those rules. Tsar Alexander's generals retreated, burning crops, destroying villages, and denying Napoleon's army the food and shelter it needed. It was the scorched earth strategy. If they could not defeat Napoleon in battle, they would defeat him with distance, hunger, and time. The French advanced through desolation. No villages to plunder, no supplies to capture. Men died not from combat, but from thirst, exhaustion, and disease. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, he found the city in flames. The Russians had set their own capital ablaze rather than let it serve the invader. For a month, Napoleon waited for a surrender that never came. Then, as the snows began to fall, he gave the order to retreat. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's greatest tragedies. Temperatures plunged to 30-degree ice. Horses collapsed by the thousands. Soldiers froze where they stood, their muskets useless against the cold. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back into Poland, only 100,000 survived. Napoleon's empire would never recover. His ambition had been buried in the Russian snow. A century later, Hitler's Eastern dream. 129 years later, history repeated itself. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. Hitler's dream was not just conquest, it was annihilation. He sought to destroy Bolshevism, to seize land for the German people, and to eliminate what he saw as racial enemies. At first, victory seemed certain. The Wehrmacht advanced at lightning speed, crushing Soviet divisions and capturing millions of prisoners. Smolensk fell, Kiev fell, Minsk fell. By autumn, the German army stood at the gates of Moscow, but just as Napoleon had discovered, the land itself began to fight back. The Russian plains turned to endless mud, the Rasputitsa, a season when roads dissolve into rivers of dirt. Tanks stalled, supply lines collapsed, Fuel and ammunition were trapped hundreds of miles behind the front. The Germans were unprepared for what came next. Winter. Engines froze, rifles jammed, soldiers wrapped newspapers around their boots to survive the cold. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had slowed to a crawl in the snow. Then, in December, the Red Army counterattacked. Fresh Siberian troops, trained in sub-zero warfare, drove the Germans back from Moscow. Hitler's dream of a quick victory was shattered. He refused to retreat. Like Napoleon, he believed willpower could overcome reality. By 1943, at Stalingrad, his army was encircled and annihilated. 1 million men were lost, and once again, the Russian winter had claimed another conqueror. Geography, distance, and the impossible supply line. Russia is not merely a country, it is a continent. From the Polish border to Moscow stretches over 600 miles of plains, open, treeless, and endless. Every mile marched is a mile further from supply. For both Napoleon and Hitler, logistics became their greatest enemy. The farther they advanced, the thinner their supply lines stretched. Food spoiled, horses died, fuel ran out, ammunition dwindled. The Russian army, meanwhile, grew stronger the deeper the enemy came. They retreated into their own vastness, trading space for time. It was a strategy born from centuries of invasion. From the Mongols to the Swedes, Russia had learned that no army can survive its winter or its distances. The French had no maps of the terrain. The Germans had modern technology but no comprehension of its limits. For every soldier that advanced, 10 were needed to carry his supplies. The math simply didn't work. Both empires collapsed under the same equation: arrogance minus preparation equals disaster. The myth of the Invincible Army. Napoleon's army was the pride of Europe. It had never known defeat on land. Hitler's Wehrmacht was the most advanced fighting force of its time. Its tanks, aircraft, and strategy had conquered half of Europe in months. But both leaders believed their own myths. They mistook fear for respect, momentum for destiny. The Stoics of ancient Rome once said, "The higher the pride, the harder the fall." And in both cases, pride blinded them to the truth. Napoleon thought the Tsar would surrender because he himself would have done so. Hitler thought the Soviets would crumble because he could not imagine endurance beyond his own. They both saw Russia as a political entity, not as a civilization forged in suffering, capable of absorbing pain beyond comprehension. They were wrong. The spirit of endurance. Russia's strength has never been in its technology or its tactics. It lies in its capacity to endure. In 1812, peasants burned their own villages to deny the French food. In 1941, citizens of Leningrad endured 872 days of siege, starving, freezing, dying, but never surrendering. This was not merely patriotism. It was survival woven into the national soul. Both Napoleon and Hitler underestimated this spirit, the willingness of ordinary people to sacrifice everything for their homeland. An invader can take territory, but he cannot conquer will. The psychology of hubris. What unites these two stories across time is not just military similarity, it is psychological tragedy. Napoleon and Hitler both believed themselves chosen by fate. Both saw the world as clay to be molded by their will. And both ignored the warnings of their generals, their advisors, and even the lessons of history itself. To believe oneself invincible is to step into the same trap as every fallen conqueror. For in the end, it is not armies or winters that destroy empires. It is the blindness of power. The mirror of history. The parallels are haunting. 2 invasions, 2 winters. 2 shattered armies retreating west through the snow, and 2 empires crumbling soon after their failure. Napoleon's defeat in Russia marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire. Hitler's defeat marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Russian campaign, in both cases, was not just a military disaster. It was a mirror reflecting human arrogance. Each believed he could rewrite history. Each forgot that history has its own rules. Empires rise when they master themselves. They fall when they try to master the world. Lessons from the frozen road. So why did both Napoleon and Hitler fail to invade Russia? Because they fought not just against a nation but against time, space, and the limits of human ambition. They ignored geography, underestimated endurance, and defied reality. In the end, the same truth destroyed them both. You can conquer lands, you can command men, but you cannot command nature or humility. And somewhere, across the frozen plains of history, the echoes of two lost armies still whisper the same warning. Pride marches east and never returns. Join us on a journey through the ages, where every question becomes an opportunity to discover. Subscribe now and start exploring life's greatest questions with us.